And welcome to another episode of the Global Wire Conversations. My name is Ralph Schellhammer and I'm your host. Today we are talking to Professor Victor Davis Hanson. Professor Hanson is an American classicist, military historian, and a columnist for National Review, The Washington Times, The New Criterion, and several other media outlets. Apart from also being a professor emeritus of classics at California State University, he is currently a fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. We are talking about his most recent book, The Case for Trump, and the general condition under which the current president is conducting his office. My first question would be about the most recent reshuffling in the national security team. How would you evaluate the ousting of Security Advisor John Bolton and what it means for the administration?
Trump played the so-called proverbial bad cop, and they tried to rein Trump in. That's not a role that Trump enjoyed. And with the advent of a new Secretary of Defense and John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, Trump wanted to create a team that they were the hardcore, the hard guys. And then Trump could say, I'm for peace. I'm trying to find a way with China and Iran that's nonviolent, or North Korea, but I got all these people around him. And that was kind of a sham, a game. But I think Bolton took it too seriously, that he not only offered the more extreme solution to all of these existing problems, not just as a way for Trump to refute him and then show that he was a moderate, but he actually believed them. And finally, that became tiresome to Donald Trump. And then finally, I think Bolton wasn't as sensitive to the 2020 election. In other words, he was more of an idealist that thought that you have to continue to be tough with Iran, you have to be continually tough with North Korea, you've got to be continually tough with China, keep the sanctions on, ratchet them up, add more tariffs, and these nations will eventually crack. And Donald Trump probably would have said to him, you're right, but I won't be elected in 2020 unless I get a China deal or perhaps maybe a breakthrough overseas. So they were at odds about pragmatism versus idealism too.
Do you think it is a fair assessment if one looks at Trump in the foreign policy domain and Trump in the domestic policy domain to describe him as a person that really tries to establish personal relations? It seems that with North Korea, then he was also mentioning that he would be willing to meet the Iranian president, and even which was heavily criticized by some, the idea to welcome the Taliban for negotiations in the United States at Camp David, at all places. That his idea is that you can build personal relations with people and then use this to conduct foreign policy?
Yes. When I wrote a biography of Trump, I noticed that the more I read these serial books that he had ghostwritten or maybe co-wrote, The Art of the Deal, The Art of the Comeback, there was a predictable and monotonous modus operandi. And it's always that Trump asked for twice what he would eventually accept. He berates the opponent, he causes chaos and confusion, but he never goes over the line of personally insulting his opposite. And once he gets a deal, he settles at 53 or 54% of what he feels is the spectrum, and then that's considered victory, even though he asked for much more. And then he has, most importantly, a cardinal rule that he never brags in a disparaging way about his own success and his own opponent's failure. So when he was doing these deals with Kim Jong-un or the theocrats in Iran or Vladimir Putin or Xi in China, whoever they are, he has a set way of doing it, and he doesn't like people to interfere and get into that process. And his answer is always the same to his critics. When John Bolton says, but you can't do this, have the Taliban here, he'll say, well, what have you done for 18 years in Afghanistan? You don't have a strategy. All your strategy is not to lose. Or he'll say, what were the six-party talks in Korea about, an agreed-on framework for the last 20 years when it led to a nuclear weapon in the hands of Kim Jong-un? Or he'll say, Uh, I don't understand what's wrong with tariffs when you've turned over your commercial future to a country like China that systematically cheats on patents, copyright, currency manipulation, technological appropriation. So in his view is that the bipartisan Council on Foreign Relations approach has not enhanced the position of the United States nearly as much as was advertised. And so he thinks he can do better as a sort of an outsider or an unpredictable material leader.
I mean, you have written extensively on the history of war and the history of warfare, from the Persian Wars, from the Peloponnesian War, up to the Second World War, including military history, strategy, and also the leaders that characterize these conflicts. Would you say it is fair to say, or maybe a little bit provocative, that the United States have been very capable in winning wars, especially on the military front, but it seems that they're losing the peace? I mean, one argument that is being made, for example, regarding Afghanistan is to say, well, we retreat, and if they do something bad again, we strike back, and it's kind of, and then we pacify them, and then we strike again, kind of always reactionary, but no long-term solution as it was conducted in Germany or Japan after World War II.
Yes. Well, I think what happened was the United States confused their success in Japan, Italy, and Germany. And that began as early as Korea, although it was not apparent manifestly until Vietnam. And then since Vietnam, in every single case except the first 91 Gulf War, we've had the same problem. And what is that problem? It's twofold. One, in the case of World War II, we were able, in an existential war, to unleash a level of punishment that met history's rules of defeating, humiliating, rebuilding, and showing magnanimity to an abjectly defeated enemy. But that required a level of force that was either considered unnecessary or unpalatable after World War II. The second thing was, when you're dealing with Vietnam, Southeast Asian wars, or wars in the Middle East, you're not dealing with a citizenry or a host nation or a host tribal culture that's had any experience in free market capitalism and consensual government. And so it becomes much harder if you're not going to defeat them, but you're just simply going to pacify them for a while. And so I think Trump came along and made the argument that nation building and the idea of transforming the Middle East to a democratic society may be the ultimate solution. And no doubt there's some evidence, some not conclusive, that democratic societies are less likely to make war either against other nations or among themselves. But the cost is too high. And we've been doing this in the post-war order, and it has not been in our interest or our allies' interest necessarily. And he cited, of course, the Libyan fiasco, the Syrian fiasco, and things like that, Afghanistan and Iraq. And so where we are now is, I guess we're in a retaliatory tit-for-tat strategy. And by that I mean, if Iran tomorrow hijacks another American boat as they did under Barack Obama, or they attack American tanker, and then Trump will use disproportionate force and take out an airfield or maybe an air base. But he's not going to invade Iran with any suppositions that he can change the Iranians' hearts and minds, although he might be able to, but he doesn't want to try. He doesn't see it as a showman and a businessman. He doesn't see it as having good optics or good cost-benefit analyses or profits. So he's not going to do it if he can help it. And I think that's where we're sort of retaliatory now. Don't tread on me, a coiled snake that pounces once it's stepped on, but is not going, as our founder said, is not going abroad to slay monsters.
In your most recent book, The Case for Trump, from the perspective as a historian and a classicist, do you think there are historical figures that allow themselves for comparison with President Trump? Would you agree with, as some say, that he's this exceptional historical figure without comparison, or do you think that he actually fits much better in kind of the longer history of U.S. executives and U.S. politicians than is usually seen?
Well, of U.S. politicians, he's very similar to Harry Truman. Harry Truman went out of office with the lowest popularity in history. He was profane. He swore. He only had one semester of college. He was considered uneducated. He had a sort of, I don't suggest it was criminal, but he was deeply involved in the Kansas City mafia patronage. And he went against the advice of what was then the bipartisan establishment. And by that, I mean, they advised him on a series of critical issues to take one course of action, and he rejected every one of those choices. And by that, I mean, he integrated the U.S. Military. He went in to create a Save the South. He recognized Israel. He fired Douglas MacArthur. He created the CIA. In all of those cases, the consensus was not to do that. And he did that knowingly that his outsider style from Missouri and his profanity and his drinking at night and playing poker was going to offend people. And then when he was done, he didn't stay in Washington, he left. Now, some 70 years after he's gone, after his tenure has expired, people think, wow, he was a very good president because he didn't want to be liked, he didn't care about the establishment. And I think that in Western traditions in general, whether you look at Sophoclean tragedy or whether you look at American traditions, the national Bible is the Western, and you look at movies like The Searchers or Shane or Magnificent Seven, that archetype of an outsider who's called in to solve a problem that the sober and judicious citizenry have no idea how to handle, whether it's cattle barons in the Western or it's a corrupt elite in Sophoclean drama. They have to solve that problem, but they resort to methods and speech and behaviors that are considered taboo or unacceptable. And people are willing to put up with it if it brings results. And then when it brings results, the tragic hero is exasperated because he never gets commiserate rewards or thanks or gratitude. And he, in anger, rides off in the sunset. And so you can see that happening with Trump. He's always proverbially whining on Twitter or even in press conferences that he's done more to help Black Americans than Obama ever did if you look at unemployment or reduced prison sentences, yet nobody gives him credit. Or he's tried to say that millions of people are thriving at 3.7 unemployment in a way that was not true at 6 under Obama, yet he gets no credit. And he doesn't seem to understand that the role that he plays precludes him getting any credit, at least for years to come after his tenure is completed.
I mean, do you think that this could be one of the major weaknesses of President Trump? The kind of on the one hand, the ability to kind of outsource important decision making. I think he has in the Federal Society regarding judicial appointments. I think he has very good people around him. But the frustration, exactly what you were just talking about, and tomorrow we're going to talk to Tim Grosclose about media bias, and it is the frustration that kind of none of these successes is recognized for a person like him who's used to the limelight, that kind of what he's doing is, in his eyes, either misinterpreted or simply not recognized at all.
I think that's a good point. It's easy to criticize the triviality and pettiness of the Trump Twitter corpus, that he gets angry about we should buy Greenland, or the hurricane is really going to go to Alabama, or Illie and Omar should go back to where her parents came from. And people get outraged. But if you contextualize that and you look at the data, never in the history of the American presidency have media watchdog groups such as the Shorenstein Center at Harvard found a president with 93% negative coverage. That is, only 7 out of 100 stories that come up on the television every day are in any way favorable to Trump. And then on top of that, we have never had a president who was investigated for 22 months by a partisan group of lawyers from the opposite party who spent over $30 million. And we were told every 6 weeks that he was going to be indicted or impeached, and they found nothing that this partisan group essentially said that he didn't collude with the Russians, and if he did obstruct the non-crime of collusion, there's no evidence that would warrant an indictment. And so what I'm getting at is we know more about Donald Trump in 3 years. 50 years prior of his business career, we know more about his family, we know more about his friends, we know more about his businesses than any other president in history. And he knows that, and yet the barrage of criticism continues, and it's natural for him to be very thin-skinned and paranoid and angry because nobody has been subject to that level of vituperation. I would just add a footnote. Remember that CNN and their CEO said during the 2015 and 16 campaign that they deliberately gave Trump an inordinate amount of free publicity. Some people have suggested that in aggregate, the newscast gave him $1 billion because he was deemed to be the weakest of the 16 candidates for president, and therefore, if he were to be nominated, Hillary Clinton would easily dispose of him, and they wanted that to happen. Then he was elected, and within hours, that coverage went from very positive to very negative. And so he knows that as well. He's very bitter about it. And that kind of clouds a lot of his attitude and temperament, but it's very understandable.
And there's a number of conservatives that I think, similarly to you, are more positively inclined towards the president. And they point out that, especially given the beginning primaries in the Democratic field, that kind of if he would, so to speak, just be quiet and kind of point at them, because I think there are strong signs that the Democrats are moving further and further to the left, and kind of that he cannot control himself. So the question is, do you think that you kind of have to accept the full package, right? I think there are many people that say, well, if Trump would do his policies, his approval ratings would probably be in the 70s, but his personality is kind of a turnoff. But could one say, well, you need to have that kind of personality to execute that kind of policies, right? You cannot, especially with deregulation and in other areas as well, you cannot do this if without that kind of personality. So it's either both or none of the above.
I think you're onto something again. And I think with Trump, people commit the fallacy of acting on their heart rather than their head. When you listen to his grating Queen's accent or the triviality of he going after non-entities, you just shudder and say, oh, not in my name, don't do that in my name. And why can't he do this? But on the other hand, what Trump is trying to say to us is there is a creeping leftward progressive project in America, and it's 360 degrees, 24/7. And I'm going to, with all my body and soul, oppose that. Now, if that means I have to get down to the teenage adolescent level and attack Nike shoes, or I have to attack Colin Kaepernick for kneeling, or I have to go after Kathy Griffin for cutting my head off in a facsimile, or I've got to go after a rapper, then I'm going to do that because it's all around us. It's insidious. It's Hollywood. It's sports. And it's biased. And it's taking America in a direction that's going to be suicidal. That's how he views his record. And then you have to juxtapose all of that against the sort of Marcus of Queensberry high road protocols of Mitt Romney, John McCain, George W. Bush, Bob Dole. And the idea was the country club Republican was too noble to stoop down to the progressive attacks. And Trump comes along and says, you didn't win a popular vote in 5, not that he did, but we haven't won one in 5 out of 6 last elections. And this is not working. And I'm going to do something different. And that fired up a base that had been somnolent. And that's the 7 or 8 million people in critical swing states of the Midwest who came out to vote for him, not just on his agenda, but as you suggest, on his combativeness. So everybody who said if he'll just quit tweeting, I'm going to vote for him, have been wrong. It's more likely, I don't like the SOB, I wish he would quit, but when I look at the alternative of socialism in Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or chaos in Joe Biden and complete nonsense with Kamala Harris and Beto O'Rourke, then I won't have any choice but to vote for Trump. Although people are very quiet about that. I've noticed that when I speak, people are very careful. And believe it or not, they're not as paranoid as you might think, because I'll say to you, well, why don't you want to say you're voting for Trump or you approve of Trump? Why do you only say that the tweets bother you? And they'll say things like, if I say that I'm going to vote for Trump, people at the club won't talk to me. Or the teacher at school might be less inclined to give my child an A when it's a borderline between an A and a B. Or, and this is very scary, when people call me up for phone polls, I don't answer truthfully because I feel that if I said that I was for Trump, the likelihood is they're biased and they'll put my name on some type of electronic list, and then I will be harassed, or I'll be in social media, or I'll be exposed, or I'll be subject to an electronic barrage someday in the future, or I'll be hacked. So the level of mistrust and fear of openly endorsing or suggesting that you approve of Trump is such that I've never seen it in my lifetime. But I think, as was true of the Bourbons, I don't know if Talleyrand said that or not, they've learned nothing and forgotten nothing. And by that I mean the same calculus of 2016 seems to be with us, and everybody says lightning can't strike twice. And my suggestion is that it will strike twice.
I mean, to go back to what you said about Harry Truman, and you mentioned this also in your book, the case for Trump. Sometimes after a certain amount of time, we look back either more benevolently or more negatively historically. As a foreigner, it always strikes me that one argument is that Donald Trump is a symptom of it's a common line, the broken U.S. system, and he's a symptom of the polarization. I think that's a better point. But the U.S. system as such, I mean, isn't the fact that a person was elected that was running against his own party to a large degree, running against the other party, running against the media once it became clear that he will be the candidate, and yet people still went out and voted for him? Didn't he kind of throw out the window the entire idea that politics is bought anyways and it's going to be Clinton versus Bush and, Yale graduates versus Harvard graduates? Apparently it was possible, if you had a message that resonated, to win the election against the entire establishment. I think that is more than just a throwaway line. He did win against the establishment.
No, it is. And you see a little bit of it in the Brexit phenomenon, where that vote was completely at odds with the establishment and the media in Britain, but more so in the United States. And what I think it reminds us that if a person gets a chance to air his views, the system is such that despite media bias and administrative state conspiracies and all of these things, a person can get out the word if it resonates. And what Trump did is he sized up the Republican field in 2016. He said, my God, there's only 4 or 5 issues that are going to carry the Electoral College in the states that matter, and that's closing the border and restoring legal-only immigration. And then he said, and stopping China's mercantile, asymmetric, predatory trade, and bringing back assembly jobs and manufacturing jobs. And then he said, and then unleashing the American powerhouse, the entrepreneurial spirit, by deregulating and reforming the tax code. And then he said, socially, going back to the melting pot, content of your character, not the color of your skin, and attacking head-on identity politics. But the Republicans thought, well, I don't want to get into any of those, either because I'll be destroyed by the progressives, or I'm afraid I have elements within the Republican Party, especially in the case of China and open borders, where I'll be seen as an apostate, and so I don't dare do that. I think Trump, as someone who goes to Europe a lot, I see elements of Trumpism, and it's very de rigueur for Europeans that express their outrage at Trump the man. I understand that, but there are elements of Trumpism that privately flicker in the minds of Europeans when they look at the European Union and they say, you know what, this is not allowing us local democracy. It's not allowing us dissent. This is basically Berlin ordered immigration policies for Eastern Europe or financial policies for Southern Europe or Brexit policies for Britain or NATO policies to the United States. And we don't really know if we want to go along with this, but we can't because we're scared, both culturally scared and politically scared on both the individual and the national level. And so I think in a weird way, Trumpism has scared the European Union because there are large countries in Eastern Europe who say, I don't like the immigration policies of Germany, and the South that say, we'll never be able to pay this interest back. And in Britain, we're done with it. And then people in the United States said, you're on the European landmass. And traditionally it was America in, Germany down, Russia out, and Russia's your chief threat. And yet if you're not afraid of it and you don't really want to pay 2% GDP for your defense needs, then why in the hell should the United States do it? And that's what Trump's message was. And it's kind of like the proverbial emperor without clothes. Nobody thought you would dare say that given the post-war orthodoxy. But once he said it, people said, it's kind of like the emperor really is naked. He doesn't have any clothes on. NATO's not sacrosanct. It's only as good as its ability to defend itself and make sure that every member comes to the aid of another with the wherewithal. And that's not true right now.
Do you think if you would be an advisor to President Trump for one day on the foreign policy, do you think it would be fair to say that actually Europe is a bigger problem, not because of what it does, but because exactly what you mentioned, for example, within NATO, but because of what it not does? I mean, historically, culturally, despite the world wars, Europe would be somewhat of a natural partner for the United States, at least with China growing stronger as being a global competitor, to a certain but less extent Russia. But it seems that for Europe after 1945 and with a little bit after 1989, kind of history literally stopped. Kind of that they didn't take the end of history as a theory, but something to be applied. And then kind of everything that rocks the boat is immediately something to be rejected.
Yes, I think from our point of view in the United States, Trump carried a big stick, but unlike Roosevelt's advice, he didn't speak softly, he spoke loudly. Obama spoke softly and carried a soft stick. But I think it would have been wiser for Trump to speak softly, according to the original dictum, and carry a big stick. By that I mean he could have gone into the room of NATO advisors, said, look, damn it, you're going to do this and this and this, and then gone out and praised NATO to the skies publicly. And he could have got out of the Paris thing and said, this thing's a farce, and then say, what, this was a very difficult decision. I respect my European partners. And they would have, I think, come along a little bit better. But much of his disdain for Europe is domestic. I don't think Americans quite knew, for example, according to the latest Pew poll, 52% of Germans have an unfavorable view of the United States. And when you tell them that, or they learn that, and then they see that we have 30,000 troops there, and then they go back to 1945 from now, and then they look at what Merkel's doing to sabotage the 2% contribution, they ask themselves, why in the world are these people our allies? That's a heresy even to think that. But that's sort of the can of worms that emerged once Trump tore off the lid. And I think there's a lot of things that needed to be addressed. I think Europe has got a real problem, and that is it's being threatened economically by China. It's being threatened demographically by its socialist practices. It's being threatened in terms of immigration by massive illegal immigration from the Middle East. And its freedoms are threatened by an overweening EU bureaucracy that, to be frank, if you came from Mars and you looked at the EU and how it functions and who has the power and who doesn't, you would say that this is Germany. It's not the EU. It's just a name for Germany because they make the ultimate decisions because of financial clout. And so there's a lot of problems in Europe. And I think they could learn from Trump, but I understand why they don't, because he's so offensive and crude, and that betrays their sensibilities. For the European diplomat of the 21st century, the model is to be urbane, careful in speech, immaculate in dress, perfect taste, guarded in views, and then go along with the orthodoxy on the feeling that not on my watch will things fall apart, and by no means be revolutionary or blunt or trying to change things because the system is so rigid that it can't be changed. And that was sort of what the Republican Party was here too before Trump. But I think they'd be wise to think that maybe it would be time to consider a different approach.
But do you think that to a certain extent, those European politicians that try to emulate Trump, or in some parts even came before Trump, whether it's the right wings in Eastern Europe or in France, partially also, of course, where I'm from, in Austria and in Italy, that it's I think the difference is in the United States, Trump was kind of forced to take over an existing party. In Europe, very often it takes the path of new parties emerging, and that has happened now on a quite regular basis. And these, at least in recent elections, they do quite well.
They do, and it's much more. You make a good point there as well. It's very much more difficult for them because you have a multi-party system. So they not only have to take over or create a new party, but they have to form coalitions to get a majority under your parliamentary system. And that's difficult to do because each time you make an alliance, you dilute a little bit of the message and then your base starts to wander. But here in the United States, Trump was like some type of virus that bored into the Republican Party. And once he took over that party, he had half of the parties in the United States, and he inherited an infrastructure that had no choice ultimately but to support him. And now it's his party. That's much harder in Europe. I can see that. And then the other problem in Europe is because of World War II, the right is much more suspect. Every time you have a very conservative politician, somebody waves the Nazi flag, or not that they don't do it here, but it's harder here. And another thing that's a little bit different too is that we have issues on the right that you don't have in Europe. And by that I mean they're grassroots issues that really excite people because of the puritanical Protestant natures of our origins and pilgrims and all that stuff. And one of them is abortion. Mm-hmm. Another one is the Second Amendment especially. So when Trump talks about we're not going to take away your guns, it's in the Constitution of the United States, and we're not going to have partial birth abortions and kill 10,000 children a year that leave the birth canal viable. That resonates in a way that it would never resonate in Europe. And the third issue is green energy, partly because we have such a huge country, partly because we have so much gas and oil. We have this lunatic radical green New Deal, and that's kind of an importation from Europe, but there's so much practical capitalist free market opposition to it, whereas in Europe the Greens have become orthodox.
That's a little bit.
They're destroying your economies because wind and solar, say in Germany, is making kilowatt prices just exorbitant, taking you back to a primordial existence almost in Germany.
I know you have to run, so if you don't mind, maybe a concluding question.
Yes.
In the next couple of years, I think, regardless of what thinks of Trump and even the kind of the Trump-esque right wing that has emerged in Europe, they definitely have touched upon topics that is important for the population, from immigration to matters of assimilation, but also in the realm of economics. I think the United States have proven kind of that the idea of secular stagnation can at least partially be defeated if you try to unleash the entrepreneurial spirit via deregulation. I think that has been demonstrated strongly in this economy. But do you fear that even if he should be reelected next year, that this is going to be the good and the bad, so to speak, that this was really just a blimp, that, in 20 years, one looks back and say, well, this was the age of Trump, and it kind of then reverted back to the Clinton-esque, Bush-esque years, and this was, so to speak, an attempt of the United States, or also in parts in Europe, kind of to rise up against certain trends, but that this is going to dissipate and it goes back to what it was before?
No, I think once you throw a rock in the pond, the ripples don't stop. And I think Trump, on about 4 or 5 things, snapped people out of their somnolent condition. And by that I mean we're not going to go back to an administration that's going to be able to say open borders are great. We need 1 million illegal aliens a year. It's not going to happen. That's still going to be attempted, but there's a majority of Americans who say we'll have no country if we have 20 million people here illegally, and they need social services and are not assimilating or integrating. That's one issue. The second is, whether we like tariffs or not, with a $600 billion surplus in China and the second largest account surplus in the world, the systematic cheating and appropriation of technology and patents and all that stuff, dumping, currency manipulation, that's not a sustainable situation. And the former bipartisan consensus that the more you indulge or concede to China, the more liberal they're going to be. And it's just a matter of time until they take their proper place in the family. That's not going to come back. That's not true. It was never true. It's not going to be a legitimate position anymore. And then finally, the idea that you're going to have a coastal culture, that globalization is the way of the future, and that people from Boston to Florida and from San Diego to Seattle are going to be our elites, and that their markets for their ideas, their insurance, their banking, their technology will be 7 billion people. And then everybody in between that uses muscular labor, well, they're just losers because their existences can be Xeroxed in Mexico or Southeast Asia or China, and they didn't learn to code, so screw them. They take OxyContin anyway, or they're dying demographic. That's not going to be a legitimate position. And we saw that in 2016. So the next Republican candidate will not do a Jeb Bush illegal immigration as a quote unquote act of love, or they won't do a Mitt Romney that we've got to help China more, or they won't do a George H.W. Bush that, manufacturing, we're in a new age where manufacturing and assembly doesn't matter. And I just don't think we're going to go back to the pre-Trump Republican Mitt Romney, Bob Dole, John McCain, the Bushes. And not just the Republican Party, but the country at large is not going to go back to some of them. I think they may go back and say, let's have presidents that don't scream and yell at rallies. Let's have presidents that don't tweet insults. That's fine. But on 4 or 5 core issues, and you can really see it with the Democratic debates, there's one tonight, notice that what they do not attack Trump on, they're not attacking him on the China policy at all. They're not attacking him on his opposition to outsourcing and offshoring. They're not attacking his demand for fair trade. They are attacking him on the border, but even there, they're very careful about what they say because that his position polls so much better than theirs. They're usually attacking him on his person, that he's crude or he's racist or he's sexist or he's homophobic, but not necessarily are they attacking him on. They talk about a new green agenda and they talk about a higher income tax, but they never say this is what we're going to do when he's out. It's more like he's a monster, get him out of here. And then when they get in, they're going to say, wait a minute, we've got to get tough with China. We've got to make sure that people in the Midwest have jobs. Wait a minute. Mexico and Central America, it's not sustainable to take their millions every year. So that's a long, windy answer, but I think his influence will be felt after he himself, his person, is sort of ridiculed, but not necessarily his positions and his agendas.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry for keeping you longer than anticipated. This was fantastic.
Oh, good. I hope it went well for you.
Yes, absolutely. And if you should ever come to Vienna in the near far future, please do not hesitate to hit me up. I'll be happy to have you and host you. So, any time you should cross the Atlantic.
That'll be good. I've gone to Vienna many times. It's a very beautiful city. I've enjoyed every time I've gone.
So I consider this a standing invitation. It's the least thing that I can do. Thank you so much. This is going to be a great start for our podcast.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.